Hi, I'm Rod Dreher. The coming U.S. presidential election is the most important one since the last time. They always tell us that this vote could be the most important election of our lifetimes. And you know what? It might not be hype. Given the state of both a troubled America and the even more troubled world beyond its shores, and given the last two presidential elections Americans had, that might actually be true every single time. The thing is, American elections are about much more than just America. The famed Middle American voters in Peoria, Illinois, might not have heard of Budapest, but as any American expatriate knows, the people of Budapest and every other city on the planet cannot afford to be indifferent to what happens in America. Well, here in the Hungarian capital, which straddles the great Danube River, we're following the race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris with just as much trepidation from inside our expat bubble. In fact, Hungary offers a peppery perch from which to view the campaigns. Prime Minister Viktor Orban has pegged his own fortunes bigly, as Trump would say, on the Donald returning to the White House. For his part, Trump has referred to his friendship with Big Vic several times in debate and media appearances. The swamp in Brussels sees Hungary as the European Union's bad boy, in large part because of Viktor Orban's unyielding stance against mass migration and his opposition to NATO's role in the Ukraine war. A Trump victory could both dramatically affect the balance of power within the European Union and catapult Hungary, through its leader's friendship with the new American president, to a position of influence far above its size. Some of us American conservatives were early to spot in Hungarian conservatism a potential model for how Republicans in the United States could reform their approach to government to quit being perpetual losers, even when they win power. If Donald Trump wins back the White House, Budapest is going to become what Prime Minister Viktor Orban said in 2019 that he wanted this city to be, an international capital of intellectual conservatism. The Danube Institute is a think tank that stands on the hills above the river facing to the geographical east towards Asia. But our orientation is towards the west, especially the English-speaking west. Like our host country, we are positioned to be a hub of connectivity in the emerging world order. My colleagues and I sat down hoping to make a connection between what the rest of the world sees of the American election and what U.S. voters actually think. This is The View from the Danube. Welcome to View from the Danube. I'm joined today by the president and founder of the Danube Institute, John O'Sullivan, our director of research, Callum Nicholson, and our deputy director, Melissa O'Sullivan. And friends, we gather here with the spectre of fascism descending over America. At least that's what the Democrats and the mainstream media are saying, as they're likening Trump to the second coming of Adolf Hitler. And this is not just a few weirdos in the media saying this. There was a cover story in the Atlantic Monthly magazine, which is one of the biggest and most important magazines, in which John Kelly, who was Trump's White House chief of staff, said that the president, quote, more than once told him that, quote, Hitler did some good things too. It's not just Kelly. We've had Kamala Harris on CNN recently, who answered in the affirmative that she believes Donald Trump is a fascist. The Democrats have gone full on with this, comparing Trump to Hitler. The thing is, this is not new in American politics. When Barry Goldwater accepted the Republican nomination, the Democratic California Governor Pat Brown said, the stench of fascism is in the air. And about President George W. Bush, our old friend George Soros said, quote, he displays the supremacist ideology of Nazi Germany. and that his administration used rhetoric that echoes Soros's childhood in occupied Hungary. So my question to you all is this just politics as usual, or is there something different this time?
Well, as you've just demonstrated, Rod, it is in a way politics as usual because it's what's happening election after election after election. But there's a famous riposte, American riposte to those quotes. And I'm trying to remember, I think it's a liberal who said it, that the eagle of fascism is always about to land in America, but it always lands in Europe. And now I don't think it does always land in Europe. It sometimes lands there, obviously. But it certainly has not landed in America. And it's hard to see how it would, because America is a political system that has got a series of checks and balances. And at the moment, if you think that, for example, Trump is the danger of fascism, you would have to explain how he would take over not only the government, but the whole of society in which most of the institutions are solidly against him. Now, those institutions are much more in favor of the Democrats. And that's why the danger of fascism, which I don't take seriously in general, but if I were to take it seriously in America, I would say it's far more likely to come from the left of the Democratic Party, which, after all, does have its own fascist red guards, or you might say fascist brown guards, in the form of Antifa, who beat people up, start fires, take over whole neighborhoods in places like Portland. So I think that it's politics as usual, but unpersuasively so.
Lisa, you have said to me before that you think the Democrats are projecting here when they accuse the Republicans of being fascist, when in fact, as John says, you see much more in terms of anti-democratic rhetoric, anti-democratic policies coming from the left.
To answer your original question, is it different? What makes this different is it's amplified. It's not just commentators, but it's elected officials. And it's not just the politician who's being tarred with this label, but the supporters. And I'm thinking about Nancy Pelosi referring to people like me who support a Trump presidency as enemies of the state, which harkens back to the language that was used by the Uzbekistan leader against one of the journalists that had to flee the country while John was at Radio Free Europe, and she wound up being one of the reporters there at Radio Free Europe reporting on Uzbekistan. So it's loaded rhetoric which says that person, they're our enemy, attack them.
And on that point, I think it does make a difference this time, because for the first time in American history, we have a presidential candidate who faced two assassination attempts during the course of the campaign. So if you're a crazed person, a lone gunman, potential lone gunman out in America right now, and you're being told constantly by the media, by Kamala Harris and Democratic officials that America is on the verge of Hitlerism, what are you supposed to do with that information? I think the Democrats know very well what they're doing.
Well, it's interesting that the one thing I've noticed throughout history is that authoritarian figures don't tend to be funny, and Trump, whatever his other faults, is funny. And I do find there's a humorlessness on the other side. I don't think it's necessarily authoritarian, but I do think it's Trump is many things, but that's one thing I think he certainly is not. And I do think, as Melissa said, it's somewhat politics as usual for people to throw these sorts of comments around. But to hear it from actually elected officials as part of actual campaign strategies seems to be a little bit shocking. Maybe we've got a short memory, though. I mean, all campaigns in America seem to be, they get to a point where they're quite combative. But at the same time, I mean, I think that Trump has been fundamentally misunderstood by everyone, I think by left and right. I mean, you know, the left think he's the Antichrist and the right think he's the phoenix rising from the ashes. But my view of Trump is he's simply the fire that creates the ashes. You know, he's the. If you look at American culture right now and the establishment, it feels like it's dried out wood, like dead wood in a forest. And when you have dead wood, you need a fire just to burn out the dead wood to create the ash from which new growth can come. And I feel Trump may not be the phoenix, but he's certainly, I think, the fire.
But I would also say, to go back to the point of the Democrats projecting their own intentions onto the Republicans, the New York Times published a piece a couple of days ago by two Harvard professors of government, Harvard, of course, talking about the things that America can do to prevent an authoritarian takeover. And one of the things they suggested, the fifth thing, was basically to have a color revolution, to have people take to the streets and refuse to cooperate. So what we have here is two professors of government at Harvard talking about how we have to overthrow democracy to save democracy. Isn't that crazy?
Let's give them their due credit. Levitsky and Zilbat are the professors in question. And for them, democracy is described as a paradox. And they're very disappointed that all these other options to stop Trump have failed. One of the first option is voting. So because they're not happy with a potential outcome, they consider that a failure, not the will of the American people as expressed through the ballot box.
Aren't we used to that in Hungary, though, that democracy is when the people vote the way the European Union elites want them to?
Well, absolutely, to the point that the European elites, and I think it was Charles Michel said about a referendum, don't hold a referendum because you don't know the kind of result you'll get. And when the European Union has got a result it didn't want in a referendum, it has asked several times now, has asked the country to vote again.
The Maastricht Treaty.
The Maastricht Treaty, one in Denmark, a treaty in Ireland, and after the defeat in the defeat of the European Constitution in France and the Netherlands, they didn't submit it, although it's supposed to be passed by a referendum. They didn't resubmit it. They simply announced they were going to introduce the same provisions, not in the form of a constitution, but in the form of amendments to the treaties and so on. So I think you have to say the commitment to democracy is has vanished to such a small point that in European Union thinking, it's simply a minor obstacle to whatever the European elite wants. So I agree with you about that. But I also think if you look at what happened in the term of Biden's government, under the guise of countering misinformation and disinformation, you are seeing the construction of a system of censorship of opinions that the government doesn't like on everything from, well, COVID in particular was one, but there are other issues, including whether or not Donald Trump was a kind of agent of the Russians. And we have seen a very sinister agreement between the media, the intelligence services, the Democratic Party and others to insist that only one set of views are respectable in politics. And that's the main danger, it seems to me, of something like fascism, which I say I don't believe will be a full-blown fascism by any means. And it's coming from the left.
Have you noticed that Elon Musk has become the big hate figure on the left, in both the United States and in Europe?
No, Musk is, but I think he's chosen this. Musk is, I think, like Trump. If you think of Trump, people often think of him as a builder. Trump was actually a branding guy. He used to take other people's buildings and brand them. And Musk has the same instinct. He knows that notoriety is a good way to sell things. Look at Tesla. It's wildly overvalued as a company, but it's mostly been a massive exercise in branding. Musk is a complete genius. He's probably the most successful marketeer since Steve Jobs in a slightly different industry. And I think he sees an opportunity to raise his profile. And this is a broader point worth making about the United States, that if you, from an outsider's perspective, what is the central idea around which America is cohesive? The one thing, everyone unifies together over the 4-year election cycle of a president. It's like the American election is bigger than the Olympics. It's bigger than the World Cup. It's the one spectator blood sport. It's the one real blood sport left, in a sense, that everyone in the world tunes in to watch. And it is this unifying spectacle. And I think part of that spectacle is this sort of performative antagonism. You see these accusations on different sides of all sorts of things. And at the time when we're in it, it feels disgraceful. But I think it's all part of the color and the pageantry almost of your country, which is built around this central sort of conflict. And it is America. This battling is fundamentally American from an outsider's perspective.
Just on that point, I would say it's fundamentally the English-speaking world. And there is a reason for this. I don't say this is true of all European countries or all English-speaking countries. But in Europe, most of the countries are governed by coalitions in semicircular parliaments in which when you have an election, power doesn't cross the floor from here to there. It moves slightly in this direction or slightly in that. And that effectively disenfranchises the voters in a curious way. They don't get to choose the policies a government party is offering in the election. They get to choose the party which then negotiates a completely different set of policies in the parliament. And in America and the English-speaking world, politics is much more, so to speak, it's much more, visceral. It's a politics of principles. The opposition says this, the government says that. You have a big battle. And naturally, when you have that kind of politics, you generally have peaceable politics, but it's vulgar, it's noisy, it's often very rude and aggressive. I thought some of the jokes went somewhat too far at the Trump festival in Manhattan, for example. But it's real. And people feel at the end of the day, even when they lose, they think, okay, well, we didn't get it this time, but our guys put up a great fight. And they'll put up that fight for the next 4 years.
You don't want to make one. Yes.
I have to disagree with my colleague here on Elon Musk. This is the man who's just had this tremendous success with a relaunchable space.
A great government-funded project, yes.
Well, so Boeing's government-funded too.
And it's falling apart.
NASA's government-funded, and they haven't been able to do anything like this. So it's not just that he's a great marketeer. He knows how to run a business very, very, very well. And look at the Starlink. To me, Tesla's like, I put that
Starlink satellite.
Yes, and he was the one who was able to provide connectivity to the Ukrainians during the war to help them prosecute the war. He should be their darling, but now because of his political speak, he's being punished by, I think, the state of California won't allow him to launch satellites from there, even though our Pentagon is utilizing them.
Oh, yeah. And
it's very counterproductive.
Can I say, I actually agree with you. I think he's a great businessman, but my point is he is a genius for branding on top of that.
Last point before we move on. The other day, the Washington Post, the newspaper in the imperial capital, declined to endorse a presidential candidate. This caused a massive meltdown among American journalists and among the Beltway elites. They thought this was the most outrageous thing, capitulating to Hitler once again, and so on and so forth. Why was this such a big deal? Because, John, you're a professional journalist. You know as well as I do that newspaper endorsements for presidential candidates don't move a single vote. Why did people fall apart in Washington?
Because this was an example of the bulletin board of the new woke establishment deciding not to endorse the candidate of the new woke establishment. And what did that mean? Well, it meant several things. One of them is that the paper was not going to be told to do what it should do, how it should recommend the voters behave by its junior editors and its HR department, because that's what's been happening in publishing and in media journalism and in all cultural institutions. This was a rebellion of the very top against the almost top. And it's very significant, and I believe it marks the turning of a tide in the media and cultural industries. I certainly hope it does. And of course, the people who were complaining, like Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post, she praised others for resigning. Has she resigned herself yet? I don't think so.
Neither did Kelly.
Yeah, John Kelly, even though he
said Trump is Mr. Fascist, yeah.
Well, I think, too, this Washington Post brouhaha shows how terrified the establishment are, the ruling class are, that they're losing power.
Yeah.
You know, as you say, it was a condensed symbol of establishment power. If the Post won't play along for whatever reason, if it's Jeff Bezos ordering it, fine. It still shows that they're losing power and they can't handle it. If you've been in power for so long, if you're so used to telling people what to do, and suddenly there's any dissent, it looks like fascism.
But it's important to say, and I have written newspaper editorials endorsing candidates in my life. I think it's important to say that if you have a newspaper which has liberal and conservative candidates, but let's say a preponderance of liberal candidates, liberal columnists and writers and reporters, the minority is perfectly happy that the conservatives who are outvoted, so to speak, in the newspaper by the liberals, they're perfectly happy with that because they reckon, well, the opposite is happening on another paper. And overall, you have all kinds of views which are being endorsed and expressed. What I think this also meant was that the uniform view of the media class in the United States, only really the New York Post and to a lesser extent the Wall Street Journal standing out against it. They were suddenly saying, we control everything except these papers and we don't want to lose anything. And I don't think journalists should think in those terms. I think they should think in terms of argument, debate, and be very happy to have a paper taking against them, as long as other papers are on their side.
Oh, you're very old-fashioned in that, John. I happen to agree with you, but I'll point out that in the news pages of the Washington Post, as well as in its op-ed pages, it has been anti-Trump from day one. Remember, the Post is the one that came up with that ridiculous histrionic democracy dies in darkness motto when Trump was elected the first time. So these people are all in, and they're all in their little bubble.
This testifies to the fact that the entire the ruling class, the political class in America is living in a fantasy world in which its only opponents are Nazis, torturers, villains of various kinds in other countries. And they can't take it when they're losing to someone whom they think is really the spiritual representative of those dark and alien forces.
Well, let's move on to cultural issues, which have played a big role in this election, most especially mass migration. You know, under the Biden-Harris administration, the U.S. has had unprecedented levels of migration across its southern border. We know of 10 million who have come across that we've been able to count. God knows how many came across who weren't counted. And this is something that overwhelming majorities of Americans dislike. But Kamala Harris was the so-called border czar, and now she's denying it. But this happened on her watch. What do you think is going to happen with migration? What role do you think migration is playing here, and how is it going to play out after the election?
Well, I think it's driving a lot of voters to Trump. That's the number one lesson to be drawn from this. And now it's hitting everyone everywhere. And, we have the issue with Haitian migrants who are being moved into communities in large numbers. And they have legal status. And so now the legal status Haitians are replacing the sometimes illegal Spanish-speaking ethnic minority. And that's causing a rift between those two ethnic groups, not to mention that in many, I have a suspicion, let me phrase it that way. I have a suspicion that the Haitians are being exploited. I have a suspicion that they're being paid wages at a lower rate and displacing other workers. I can't prove it. I don't know it, but I have a suspicion.
In Chicago, there have been open conflicts between Black voters and Latinos. Black voters getting angry at the Democratic politicians for bringing in so many migrants, whom the Black voters there think are taking away Black jobs. So I think this accounts, too, for the fact that Trump is doing extraordinarily well for a Republican among Black voters.
Now, in New York, people who are working in the charitable space report that the homeless in a city do not have an address, whereas the newly arrived migrant has an address.
Yeah, we're setting them up. Now, here in Europe, we're used to mass migration driving Islamic extremism, anti-Semitism, that sort of thing. In the U.S., I think it's a little bit different. I think that plays a part of it, but mostly the anti-Semitism that we've seen shockingly emerge in America this past year seems to me to be driven by both Muslim migrants, but also, and maybe predominantly, progressives, especially on college campuses. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I actually think the migration topic, sometimes we need to reframe it a little bit, because I think that migration is often seen as a pathology, and I wonder often it's more of a symptom of a pathology, in the sense that if you look at the cultures we live in, we have, if you take Europe, for instance, we have declining birth rates, demographic challenges coming. There's still this expectation of economic growth, and the expectation remains, and the populations are curving off. And how do you fill that space between? How do you provide the population to maintain the growth? Some people say you don't. What you do is you provide innovation, but innovation only really goes so far. And actually, a lot of innovations now are putting people out of jobs rather than giving them jobs. It creates more social challenges. Then you have the option of family policy, like they're pursuing in Hungary. It's a quite intensive, resource-intensive approach. And the third option is immigration. And if you look at the Italians, it's very interesting, because Meloni in Italy came into power on an anti-immigrant platform, and or at least that was a significant part of her platform. And then once in power, recognized that in order to deal with a stagnating economy, stagnating labor market, you needed immigration to do that. And so there's an interesting kind of tension then, because I think as long as we have a broader system that requires economic growth as it does, there's always going to be a demand for new labor in the sort of globalized labor market. And so I think we can agree that higher rates of immigration are leading to greater diversity in the community, and this leads to tensions and so on. At the end of the day, if we want to fix these sort of problems, we've got to look at what is the structure of the entire economy. It's very difficult, my point is, to separate out migration from the economy.
John strongly disagrees.
I strongly disagree.
No, go for it.
The option for a government which wants to increase economic growth and which doesn't have enough workers available to do it is to encourage the switch to automation, to higher grade industries, retraining people and bringing back into the economy, as in Britain particularly, and in America particularly, all those people who in the last 20 years have gradually opted out of economic life. Now, some do so because they retire, but many more do so because they're discouraged. The jobs that used to be available aren't there anymore. Nobody is really trying to bring those jobs back. And that's what fuels, I think, the argument. Now, I do think that the problem with migration is it's a problem anyway you're going to have, because if you're introducing people from different races and cultures, you're going to have some tensions. But those tensions were admirably coped with and overcome in the period from 1880 until about in the middle of the 20s. Why? Because the American people, both the government and private industry and civil associations, collaborated to carry out massive nationwide programs of Americanization. And this was a huge self-conscious attempt led by presidents like Teddy Roosevelt. And now what did that mean? It meant they didn't have multiculturalism. It was the opposite. Multiculturalism actually aggravates all the inevitable tensions of a multiracial society. So whether you're right about the economic argument, I think we probably agree that we need to have a self-conscious attempt to move back towards an Americanization program, and in any other country which has, for whatever reasons, large numbers of immigrants, the same kind of civil acculturation.
I think, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add to that. I agree with you, John, actually. And I think that the two things worth saying. One is that it was very interesting in 2008 when the financial crisis hit the UK. there are these three types of jobs, sort of known as the 3Ds in migration research circles: dirty, demeaning, and dangerous. Right, and those jobs were not being taken by Brits. They were only being taken by immigrants. Brits refused to do them. So there needs to be sort of I think, a cultural change on how we view things. But also, it strikes me that. Well, actually, I'll leave my second point for later.
Okay. Well, I think, John, along the lines of what you were saying, I think this election is, and the polling now is showing how frustrated Americans are with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or wokeness. The Democrats have pushed this so hard. The New York Times reported just the other day that when she came into office, Kamala Harris went in and inserted this sort of consciousness in everything she touched. She's a true believer in DEI, and yet we're starting to see companies back away from it because it hasn't worked. It has made people within companies, within universities and so forth, even angrier at each other and more mistrustful of each other. And this is one thing I'm hopeful for if Trump should go in, because he does talk about making America great again. And what made America great was the old-fashioned melting pot.
That's right. And nobody now is making the case strongly for that. I agree with you. It's implicit in a lot of what Trump says, but he hasn't been making it absolutely clearly. And I do think that is a winner. By the way, if he doesn't, or if the Republicans don't, and by the way, the Republicans before Trump failed to look at that issue seriously. But if he doesn't, some Democrat will. There always will be in a free political system a political entrepreneur who sees a hidden market and he'll go for it. And that's, of course, what Trump did.
Now, there's been a tremendous gender gap in the American electorate this year. The women are heavily on board with Kamala Harris. Men are strongly in favor of Donald Trump. Interestingly, a poll came out the other day in Norway asking Norwegians which of these Americans would you support. Most Norwegians chose Kamala Harris, but when you broke it down by demographics, Norwegian women overwhelmingly for Harris. Norwegian men, an amazing number of them, voted for Donald Trump. If this gender gap holds in the United States, we're going to see the biggest gender disparity since 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. What accounts for this?
Well, abortion is one issue. There will always be a group of women who that is their number one issue. And so that that's probably 30% of the female vote.
That's true. That's true.
So that's one. And the other, this may sound a little chauvinistic coming from a woman, but I think some people want a daddy.
Well, I know a lot of my conservative male friends, they can't talk politics in their house because their wives, though they're conservative, despise Donald Trump. They think he's a pig, he's a chauvinist, and all that. So I think that there's probably some of that.
But this is what I don't get about those women. I've sort of had a little bit of a conversation with a woman like this in the UK recently. She's appalled with Trump's rhetoric, but I don't hear any concern about the human trafficking that's going on at a massive scale with the women and children coming over the border in massive numbers, and how many of them are being shuttled into a life of sex, being sexually trafficked, or the children that are just used as a prop to help get them across the border and then abandoned into who knows what. All the numbers of unaccompanied children crossing the border is staggering. And there is no plan. There is a plan to bring in huge numbers of people from other countries. There is no plan as to what happens after except to dump them.
Well, and what about how the Democrats' love of all things transgender have made female-only spaces unsafe, and they've taken away trophies from female athletes, where you have men, biological men who call themselves women, are now suddenly winning all these contests. Why doesn't that seem to upset American women more?
Well, I think that's a real mystery, because that all stems from the fact that the left And a lot of American society and European society has bought completely into the transgender ideology. Now, the result is that, for example, a whole series of between 1970s and the other day, a lot of rules and laws came in to protect women in all various ways, in work, in society, in travel, and so on. And those protections, which are very simple ones, like women's only railway cars, for example, that kind of thing, but protecting women physically against attack, those have been, in a sense, dumped by the sexual liberty movement. And most women, I believe, are against that. I mean, even those women who support the sexual revolution in general, they are completely opposed to the fact that female-only protections are now being shared and claimed by men in dresses. And I'm astonished the degree to which hostility to the so-called TERFs, the women who protect
trans-exclusive radical feminists.
Trans-exclusive radical feminists. They're not particularly radical sometimes. They're simply women who say, we're women and we think we should have protections that men and society have agreed women should have. And now we're being told we must accept a male rapist who claims to be a woman in a woman's prison. These kind of things strike, I think, the average voter as completely crazy, and yet they've captured a large part of the political class. And that's why, and not only the political class, but I would define the class of the lumpen intelligentsia, the people in those jobs in society who transmit the views of the establishment and the new culture to everybody else, people who are policemen, nurses, not janitors.
Teachers, school teachers.
Very much school teachers. And so what you have is a new weird class, sex class war. And I don't quite understand how that is being maintained. But it is under attack from the electoral process. That is the place where the voters can reject critical race theory and dividing children into different groups and being told you're an oppressor, you're oppressed. And this kind of thing strikes the ordinary voter as mad. And yet he or she can't find a way of getting out of that mess.
Well, I think in part because so many Republican politicians are terrified to speak out against it.
Yes.
And I think the media are carrying a lot of water for the trans side. I don't think most people realize something that has just come out. It came out earlier this year. The New York Times did one piece on it and then dropped it, but it has come out in a big way in the state of Alabama's brief before the U.S. Supreme Court on a trans healthcare for children case. It has emerged that Rachel Levine, the transgender, male to female transgender, who is a top official in the Biden administration, pressured the World Organization that governs transgender healthcare to ignore the science and pass guidelines allowing children of any age to receive hormones and transgender treatment. Not only that, the same organization commissioned a special report from Johns Hopkins University to find out about transgender healthcare. Is it making a difference with kids? They found results that didn't fit what the radicals wanted, so they've suppressed it. I mean, it's extraordinary, and the media are turning a blind eye to this because they don't want it out there.
Well, I believe, similarly, I think equally good example is in Britain, where the Cass Review, which was regarded by everybody as the gold standard report on gender theory, demonstrated the medical advantages of affirmative theory were nugatory, negative actually, and everybody accepted this, except the National Health Service is still in some of its hospitals mandating affirmative theory, in other words, giving children below the age of consent either drugs or surgery, which will completely ruin their normal sexual activity forever. They can't have children, their breasts are removed, they can't be given back, and that kind of thing. And yet there is the class I was talking about, the foreman class, between the political establishment and the people, insists on trying to carry on with this, even though it's been condemned in Britain, in Norway, in Sweden, and I think in another European country.
Callum.
So I was thinking about your question about what is Trump's appeal, and before we were talking about migration, and I said I had a second thing to say, but I left it. And what I wanted to say was that I think one of the major issues with migration, and it links to Trump, is this loss of cultural confidence. We're not confident in our own culture. And therefore, the problem is not so much, I think, in some ways, immigration as such, as John was saying, it's the lack of programs to say our culture is worth people learning about and deferring to if they come. There's this reservation about people saying, we're proud of our culture, and if you come here, you need to operate on our rules. Now, how does that link to Trump? Well, there's something very interesting has happened in the last 40 years. If you think about what happened in the 1980s and in the early years of the sort of neoliberal consensus, there was this idea that everyone needs to be an entrepreneur of their wealth. The implication of that is that you should sort of lose confidence economically unless you're always pushing to be more, right? It created a sort of economic anxiety in people. By the 1990s, this has spread from our wealth to our health. We suddenly found eating disorders took off. People became obsessed with gym culture. It was kind of founded around this idea that you should be an entrepreneur of your health, but founded on an anxiety that I'm not good enough in my body, in a sense. And I feel the last 15 or 20 years, what we're seeing is adding to this is now we're being told to be entrepreneurs of ourselves, which is kind of implied that we're never good enough as people. We're not moral enough as a community. And there's this loss of confidence. And that bleeds into why I think we are not a robust enough culture in the face of immigration. But it also, I think, explains the appeal of Donald Trump. Because what Donald Trump has done is something very interesting. He's appeared in the public space, a very flawed man. He's a flawed guy, and he's fine with that. He lives big or
goes
bigly.
to McDonald's.
Yeah,
loves McDonald's.
he's a guy who eats at McDonald's. Doesn't really care if he speaks off the cuff. He doesn't say anything correctly. There's something about Trump, regardless of his politics, and I'm not even sure when I say what his politics are. I'm not sure he knows, but he simply is, and he is fully confident with being him, warts and all. And I think there's something very appealing about someone who has the courage to stand in the public space and be like that, because actually what's happened to us is that the public space has increasingly invaded the private space. There's very few spaces left in our life where we're able to tell an off-color joke, or to be flawed, or to simply misspeak, or whatever it may be.
But you can be canceled.
You can be cancelled, and with camera phones everywhere and recording things everywhere. I mean, you never know where it's what's going to happen to you.
Or you can be put in jail.
Yeah, and actually, the cultural norms have become such that now people are policing each other's private conversations, even if they say something clearly in dark humor. You know, and so I think that the real power of Trump's appeal, particularly to men, and I think to women too, but men in particular everywhere, being told that simply to be men often is to be inherently flawed, and you need to sand off all the rough edges and be this sort of perfectly sort of smooth sort of personality, you know. And I think it riles a lot of people. It's difficult to attain. It is impossible to attain that impossible standard. And the thing that I think is quite, you mentioned about Trump being a kind of father figure to people. I'm not sure about.
I didn't mean that at all. You misunderstood what I was saying. What I'm saying is there are some women who want the caretaker. They want the parent. They want the government to take on the parental role.
Oh, I see. Well, what I was going to say with Trump is that I think sometimes just in his sheer, I suppose, confidence or boldness, just to stand up there and say something that isn't particularly PC, you know, is itself culturally significant.
Well, I just have this one point to add and amplify what you've just said. Everything you said is true, but there's an additional point. In the last election that he fought and lost, he was the Republican campaign. There wasn't a Republican, but Trump, surging around the country, personally, was in a sense maintaining on his shoulders the entire argument. That was when I first became kind of liking him, because previously I thought he was somewhat of a jerk as well. But he did this, and then he makes this catastrophic error, in my view, of seeming to approve of approving of an unconstitutional block to his remaining in office.
About January 6th.
January the 6th, right. And then I thought he's finished now. And in fact, I didn't want him anyway. I wanted another candidate in the Republican Party. But against all of the odds, against everything that's been thrown at him, against the opposition of the leader of his own party, against the lawfare system which has tried to imprison him, on a whole series of grounds, some of them manifestly spurious and fake, he has managed to claw his way back to what is possibly a considerable electoral victory. I don't think any normal person in other circumstances could look at that and not feel a considerable degree of admiration for the sheer strength of character and the sheer adventure that we're witnessing on television. And I think that the failure of the left to see that as a threat is just demonstrate how remarkably dim and dull they are as in terms of their imagination.
Well, let's switch over to the dismal science for a second, the economy. This is a huge issue for the American people. Donald Trump asked at his Madison Square Garden rally, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? The famous question Ronald Reagan put to the American people in the debate with Jimmy Carter. Well, the fact is most Americans aren't. 52% of them say that their economic situation is worse now than it was when Biden took office. 63% of the American people say the country is going in the wrong direction. Now, the two aren't necessarily the same, because there are people who are doing pretty well that still think the country's going in a bad direction. What I want to put to you all, though, is James Carville, the Democratic consultant James Carville's famous statement, "It's the economy, stupid," talking about the Clinton election. Does that still obtain? Is it the case that people are going for Trump because they're sick of the inflation, crazy inflation rates, and they're sick of the cost of housing?
Well, I'm not sure if it's still the economy is stupid, but it is a stupid economy in the sense that I think the economy now has just been, it's been so taken over by service industries, and the way that in the West we've simply outsourced anything that actually makes anything abroad. And it's I saw someone say the other day that if there was a war that happened, what you need is the industrial capacity to actually start manufacturing arms. And we simply don't have the industrial base anymore. We could fight maybe a Twitter war, but I'm not sure, or a culture war. I'm not sure we could really fight an actual war right now at any particular scale.
Trump certainly believes in this. You're saying you don't know what he believes in. He certainly believes in onshoring. And in his first administration, the aluminum industry reopened plants because he stopped the dumping of aluminum products coming in via Canada and Mexico, having a screw added, and it coming in under the NAFTA trade agreement as a Canadian or Mexican good when it was actually Chinese aluminum. And, the trade policy of the Trump administration was one of the most beautiful things in the world from my perspective. So that's certainly what he believes in. He believes in a level playing field. And if we're buying a lot of your product, Germany, if we're buying a lot of your cars, you better think about what tariff you're putting on our imports coming into your country.
John, as an old Thatcherite, it must be striking to you to see that the Republican Party and its nominee for president now is coming out against free trade agreements in favor of tariffs. It certainly seems that the Republicans have truly become the party of the working class now, as people have been predicting for some time.
Well, I think I am a Thatcherite, and I think by and large free trade is a good thing. But there is such a thing as actually 100 years ago, Arthur Balfour, the Conservative Prime Minister, facing in his own party a strong demand for tariffs, which he was nervous about, he proposed something which we should all consider, the principle of reciprocity. We will have free trade with people who have free trade with us. We won't have free trade with people who organize themselves in a mercantilist way to exploit our markets, but not open their markets to us. And I think that was the policy that Americans, Republicans and Democrats successfully carried out after the Second World War. I think it got unbalanced in the post-Cold War years, partly because governments, including the Republican governments, they thought, well, we want to sort of help China to move towards democracy. And the way to do that is to give it a really good entry into the world trading economic system and allowing them to keep all the protections they wanted, including a huge exchange rate misvaluation. So No, I mean, I think horses are for courses. Policies are for the occasion. They don't always work, and sometimes they do. So I'm in favor of consumption taxes rather than income taxes. Tariffs are a consumption tax. They're not, in my view, the best one, but they are. And I think they should be part of any sensible conservative economic policy. But I don't want to get rid of free trade because I don't want American markets to be closed to Europe, and I don't want the world's markets to be closed to American trade and exports, because that's what will happen if you have a full-scale trade war.
Callum brought up something really interesting a moment ago about how the United States and Europe, too, frankly, have lost their industrial capacity to make weapons of war. We've seen with the way NATO countries, especially the U.S., have sent so many missiles and things like that to Ukraine that if we got into a war with China over Taiwan, which is looking increasingly likely, what would we do? What would the United States do? What do you think the role of China and more broadly Ukraine and war has been in this American election? We've seen a collapse over the past year or so of the support the American people have for the Ukraine war. J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, has been openly against NATO's policy. And I think a lot of people think that if Trump goes in, the war is going to be settled. What do you think?
Well, under Trump, we had peace and prosperity. So we've just talked about the prosperity part. I think many Trump supporters feel that that Russia would not have invaded Ukraine were Trump president, and I think you could make that case. So I think we're getting unconventional voters to come over. We know that we've gained great traction with Jewish voters coming over.
October 7th, and the way that the left has gone so far towards anti-Semitism.
Yes, so I mean, that action, the war there between Israel and now Hamas and Hezbollah has again resulted in a shift in the voter public, in certain traditionally Democrat voters moving over to the Republican ranks.
I do feel that what's been happening the last couple of years has exposed some of the hubrises of the establishment, be it left and right. I mean, I think the thing with the states right now is that people always talk about the fear of political extremism, but I think actually the thing we should be talking about, and is definitely a problem that is an obvious problem, is economic extremism. This sort of idea that we are only consumers, we're not citizens. This very sort of neoliberal consensus you see of the centre left and centre right in the last few decades. From a British perspective, I think, Barack Obama was probably to the right of David Cameron, who is the conservative leader. So it's, from my perspective, it's all much of a muchness. But I do think if you look at what's been happening in the world the last few years, it's sort of been falsifying, I think, the shibboleths and orthodoxies of the era we've been living in for so long. So it's not so much that the events of the last 4 years of the way that America left Afghanistan, I don't think they should have been there, but the way they left was really exposing the fact there was no real commitment to a cause. It was all expedient. Exposing the falseness of the narrative around that we're here to do good, I think was puncturing that vanity in a sense. And I think a lot of the current events we're seeing geopolitically are doing this. And I think what it's doing is not so much dissolving the Democrats, but it's dissolving the establishment. Because Trump is fundamentally is an anti-establishment candidate. True. And his appeal, a lot of people who voted for Obama in 2012. Like he's got quite broad appeal.
John.
Long before Trump was elected, I predicted that his policy in foreign policy would be based on Herman Cahn's famous argument. Herman Kahn said, the way to win the game of chicken, that is two teenagers in fast cars riding towards each other, and the guy who pulls away first is chicken. The way to win the game of chicken is to get into the car, visibly drunk, and then, as you're speeding towards the other chap, you throw the steering wheel out of the window. I said that will be Trump's foreign policy. And in fact, and I agreed with everything you said, Melissa, on Ukraine before. But remember, in addition to his being cautious, on Ukraine in some ways. He gave the Ukrainians javelins. He was the first president to give them weapons. Yes. Secondly, when there was the Russian mercenaries, the Wagner group in Syria, he killed about 200 of them he ordered attack on them, which killed about 200 of them in one day. From Putin's point of view, he is and was an unpredictable figure. That's why I don't believe that Putin would have escalated the war by directly invading Ukraine. And I'm one of the people who think that had to be responded to, and I support what NATO did. But it is clear now that if he gets in, he will have good reason to say to Putin, we can do you a lot of damage, not only by giving more weapons to the Ukrainians, but also by simply having a very aggressive policy of reducing, increasing American energy, which will reduce the proceeds to your treasury and create a real problem for you. Now, you know that. So let's now sit down and work out how we can end this thing without anyone being killed further or either of us being humiliated. And that's what I think will happen. He may not win. He may not succeed.
Well, I have found in going back to the U.S. from Hungary during the war, the Ukraine war, it's always been striking to me how close the conversation is about Ukraine. Here in Hungary, the Hungarian government is, again, it's not supporting Russia's invasion, but it also doesn't agree with NATO's policy. There's an actual debate here. But in America, I've seen very little debate. And this is because the media do not seem to believe that there is another side to this question. But you don't see that reflected in the polls now, where you have, I think, only 25% of Americans believe that we should increase aid to Ukraine. More than that believe we should reduce it. So this is clearly an issue with the American people, even if not among the American elites. I think that people are sick and tired of what we call the forever wars. And I think one of the most telling moments of this entire campaign is when Dick Cheney, who was the arch villain of the left during George W. Bush's years, because he was one of the chief architects of the Iraq War, when Dick Cheney endorsed Kamala Harris, and his daughter Liz Cheney has been out campaigning for Kamala Harris. If that doesn't tell you what's really happening in America now, that the American establishment is behind war and Trump is not.
And I will take Bobby Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard any day over Liz and Dick Cheney. So that was a really good trade, I think.
You know, we were talking about the weirdness. That's what I wanted to end on today, because it's been pretty heavy, all the things we've been talking about. But have there been moments in this campaign where you thought, this is awfully strange? I'll tell you what it was for me. When Trump got on the thing about how the Haitian migrants in Ohio are barbecuing people's dogs. Now, the media got really angry about that and said, this is racist, this is wrong, there's no proof of this and all that. I'm not sure if there was no proof of it, but J.D. Vance made a very good point. He said, if we hadn't done that, none of you in the media would talk about the impact mass migration is having on small towns like Ohio that are being overwhelmed by this policy that's favored by Washington, but small town people are paying the price. So bringing up the crazy eating the cats story turns out to have been politically quite useful to force the media to focus on an actual serious issue. But still, it was pretty weird to hear the president or former president of the United States say in the debate, they're eating cats in Ohio.
But it's weirder to think you can increase the population of a city by something like 30%.
Oh, I know. Well, that's the point, though.
But I mean, that's what's so irrational and such a turnoff to the American voters over the current immigration policy. The numbers, they're so huge. It's not it's not manageable.
Right.
And you have Martha's Vineyard freak out over, one busload of people.
Okay. He's got a funny joke to tell us.
No. Well, it's not my funny joke, but Jonah Goldberg makes the good point. He said, in any murder mystery on television, you know who the guilty person is. Somebody makes an accusation. He says, there's no evidence of that. He doesn't say, I'm innocent. and in fact, so the point is, when the press, the mass media say, there's no evidence of the cats and dogs being killed and eaten, that immediately ordinary viewers are going to say, well, you say that about virtually everything. If there was evidence, you wouldn't show it to us, you see. So that the media is in a weak position on that. But I'm not concerned so much about that. I think that what's been most, this is odd, a paradox more than anything else. The moment which I sat up and took notice was when, after watching Kamala Harris stumble her way through the CNN interview with an embarrassing series of a display of ignorance of things she should have known deeply about, we go over to the commentators and David Axelrod. David Axelrod is an Obama top man who was with him. He was an old school Chicago journalist, political journalist. And finally, he is definitely now in the tank for Kamala. But he wasn't in the tank for her. What he said was, this was a very embarrassing thing, he said. And he coined a marvelous term. He said, whenever she was asked a good question, she retreated to repeating a word. She retreated into word salad city. Yeah. And he went on to explain why. Now, that I thought was very curious, because he's the kind of person who will do what he can to save the Democratic ticket. But the best way, as he advised, is to concede when things are bad. You've got to concede something. And the Democrats are running a campaign that Reagan ran well in 1984, Morning Again in America, but it's obviously not Morning Again in America, is it? So you can't run that campaign.
It's been funny how Kamala presents herself as the change candidate. Yeah. She went on The View, the talk show The View, and they said, well...
The View from the Danube?
No, not the bad View.
Oh, okay, I see. Right.
And she went on The View, and they said, well, what would you change over the last 4 years? She said, I can't think of a single thing. So everything was perfect, but we have to change. It's nuts. Yeah. Callum.
Well, I think quite self-evidently, the weirdest thing that happened in the campaign was seeing Democrats stand up in the last couple of weeks and talk about Dick Cheney as a bastion of moral virtue and just a good man, which itself was amusing. But the thing, honestly, that stayed with me, and I thought it was interesting at the time, and quite honestly, I've not seen anyone really talk about this, was that, do you remember when Trump got shot? And afterwards, there was that photograph of him raising, I think, his fist, and behind him, the police officers are holding him. Yeah. There's a flag flying behind. If you look at that picture, it's exactly the same positions of all the people involved, including him, as the famous Iwo Jima picture with the people putting that flag up. Even the woman in front of Trump with her arm across him, yeah. There's someone in the same position in that picture. It looks like someone's taken the picture and just photographed it from the front, and gender swapped a couple of the soldiers and put Trump in as the key soldier and inverted the flag. And there was something very interestingly symbolic I found about that. I put the two pictures next to each other and sent it to a few friends, and I said, these two images mark, I think, the beginning and end of the liberal era. The first one began the era of American liberal, this sort of American-centric liberal world. And that moment of Trump's defiance, rising, having almost been shot.
Fight.
But what it said is that he'd survived it. But because he survived it, I thought as soon as he got shot and he survived it, I thought he's definitely winning the election. There's no way that someone will be perceived as a man of destiny on a mission. And I thought what he will do is bring in a post-liberal order. And if you look at who he selected as his running mate in J.D. Vance, a famous post-liberal politician informed by people like Gladden Papin, who's here, yourself, various other people. And it's very sort of... so I think these pictures are almost the bookends of an era. And for me, the symbolic sort of chiasmus of that, the sort of the framing of it was stunning. And I found that it almost made me think we're living in a simulation, and quite a good one, actually.
Well, and can I say another weird thing has been the fact that here we are, almost at election day, a candidate was shot. We had this picture of him with blood coming down his face. He was shot. And then the Secret Service foiled another assassination attempt, and it's gone straight down the memory hole. Isn't that bizarre?
It's a very bizarre, and it's a security big fat fail. And the best explanation that I have heard as to how that could happen was someone saying it's not that they're trying to get him assassinated, but they're creating a funnel down which bad actors can go. It's a very depressing thing to see how a once very respected agency, the Secret Service was always respected within the security community. And this is a very, very sad thing to see.
Sure, but it's the media too, that two assassination attempts. And that was last week's news, it seems. Yeah. That seems fundamentally...
To be fair, there is so much happening. It's such a carnival, the whole thing. It's very hard for anything 3-4 days ago to still be remembered by anyone. Trump's actual first shooting was so significant that obviously it kept in the news for a few weeks. But even it feels like a lifetime ago now, honestly.
But what Rod's making the point is that the media has intentionally not done it. And it's the great quote, it's who controls the echo, not the sound.
Oh, that's good, yeah. John, you want to?
Well, I'm interested. We've been talking about this now for, I suppose, almost an hour. And yet we haven't really said whether the question should be, is Trump or is Kamala likely to be the next best president of the United States? Because that's, in a curious way, that's not what the election this time is about. I mean, it normally would be. Will Kennedy be better than Nixon, or the other way around? But that's not what people are thinking here. Because they're looking, I think, at Kamala and at Waltz, and they're thinking they are unimpressive people. They're not the kind of people whom we can say, well, she'd make a great president. And if she's collapses or something, he would be a great substitute. And on the other side, with all his faults, we're not just choosing Trump, are we? If we vote in that, give that mark our cross there. He's standing with not only J.D. Vance, he's standing also with Elon Musk, with Tulsi Gabbard, there's someone else. Oh yes, with Robert RFK. What we're being offered in a way is the America which was created or influenced or shaped by Obama against the America that existed before Obama. And that's a really interesting choice, because Obama himself said that whether Reagan would be successful or not would depend on whether he replaced him. And he has replaced him, but now he's in danger of being dislodged. And the old America, in all its variety, is coming back if he wins. If he loses, we're looking forward, I think, to a long, dull period of being governed by an establishment with neither courage nor imagination.
The old, weird America, as Brian Marcus
I would slightly just say one thing. I'd slightly disagree with John. Yeah. My sense is that whether it's Clinton or then Bush or anyone really, there is an establishment position. It's a very neoliberal establishment position. Both parties were pretty dominated by it. The reason, the people who really didn't like Trump initially, by the way, weren't the Democrats. They loved Trump because they thought he would lose the election for the Republicans. The people who didn't like him were the establishment Republicans.
They're never Trumpers.
Yeah, they're never Trumpers. Now all those people have since signed up to him because they see it's in
not
the way
all.
forward. Not all. But the point is that I think that it's not so much going back to something. I think we've had something that has run its course. You could start it in 1945, or you could start it in 1980, or you could start it a little bit later. But it's run its course now, and and the candidates we have in place right now are it's a zombie culture in terms of the establishment. I think it's an option of continuing that on for another 3-4 years until it really gives up the ghost, or choose a candidate who I don't think, as I said, is the phoenix from the fire, but Trump is the fire, the bonfire of the vanities of the establishment, from which the ashes from which new growth can come, which might be Vance, I think, in 4 years.
Yeah, exactly. I am voting for Trump, not because I particularly like or admire Trump. I'm voting against the establishment. I think a number of Trump voters are that way, and I'm not at all apologetic about that vote. But I'm really voting for J.D. Vance.
Yeah, Trump is an incubator for Vance's...
Yeah, I think he's the gateway to the Vance era, because Vance is a millennial. He doesn't have the baggage of the war or of Reaganism. He's on the right, but he's also an intellectual. And boy, has he been impressive on the stump. I think he's the real success story of this election.
And he wasn't created by the political class.
Exactly.
He was a self-made man before he became a politician.
And just one little detail, though, that I think makes Trump a far more historically significant figure than Obama will ever be. And because remember, Trump's origin story basically was that White House Correspondents' Dinner where Obama invited him in, or he was invited and then mocked him in front of a crowd. That, I think, galvanized Trump to run. And there was this self-satisfaction to the way Obama did that, I felt. But what Obama did throughout 8 years is he had the same vice president who was much older. No one ever thought he would ever be, he was too old to be president, of course. You know how that ended. But what Obama left behind was nothing behind. He didn't build the party. He didn't build grassroots. He didn't put in Supreme Court justices. He didn't convince people on his side to retire from the Supreme Court when they could have retired. They kept their positions. He didn't build anything after him. And what Trump is doing, for all Trump's ego, and everyone says Trump's very sort of narcissistic guy all about himself. Look what he's done. He's selected a young guy. He picked the one guy who might actually overshadow him in terms of a guy who's a legitimate intellectual, who's young, quite dynamic. He's picked someone who's not so much a team of rivals, but he looks like he's creating an incubation of someone who can carry something forward afterwards.
But he left behind something else, Obama, this, in your story, and that's Trump. But he set in motion a series of elephant traps that meant that Trump could not actually govern for at least 2.5 or 3 of the years of his presidency in a normal way that a president can. He was handicapped and hobbled and hogtied in various ways. And that, presumably, if Trump wins this time, won't be true. Which doesn't mean he'll be able to ride roughshod over the Constitution. There'll still be a lot of opposition to him, including in his own party. But he will not be wrongly hogtied. He will not be wrongly prevented from governing at all.
John, it sounds like you don't believe that democracy will die in darkness.
It will die in the daylight that has until now not been allowed to shine on a lot of American politics by a media that enjoyed living in the darkness, which it excoriated.
Well, let me say to our Hungarian listeners that we are going to be here at the Danube Institute on November 6th, the day after the American election. We're going to have an event that breaks down the election results, talks about them. We'll involve the audience in discussing it. It's going to be at 6 p.m., from 6 to 8 p.m. here at the Danube Institute on Csanak utca. Go to danubeinstitute.hu, danubeinstitute.hu for more information and to register. And I think it should be a really lively evening, no matter what happens in America on the 5th. Well, this has been View from the Danube podcast. On behalf of my colleagues, John, Callum, and Melissa, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.